Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the AAA's first webinar of 2021. Today, we'll be focusing on the Building Better Regions Fund. For those who don't know me, my name is Samantha Layton, and I'm the Regional Airports Manager and Industry Development Manager here at the AAA. Today, we've got Andrew Morris from Morris and Piper Advisory, who will be taking us through the Building Better Regions Fund guidelines, as well as the application process for round 5. Andrew comes to us today with an extensive career within the Department of Infrastructure, both working and drafting these guidelines as well as advising on them. We do hope that you find today's webinar valuable. You can ask questions using the questions tab on the control panel on your screen right now, as well as download Andrew's presentation using the handout section as well. We do hope you find today's presentation valuable, and feel free to provide feedback on both this webinar and anything that you would like to see in the future. Thank you so much for joining us today. And Andrew, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Sam. Sorry, I'll just get the presentation going. I hope you can all see that. Look, thanks again, everyone, for joining me. Hopefully there's a few people who tuned into the webinar or at least seen the webinar from last year on the 20th of December that talked about the Building Better Regions Fund and government grants funding or applying for government grants in general. As some of you may be aware, the round has now launched. It launched on the 5th, it launched last week and now closes on the 5th of March. So what I'd like to do today, apart from providing a brief overview of the Building Better Regions Fund, for those of you who haven't seen the previous webinar, is to run you through the guidelines and application form and provide some tips and some comments on how you might go about applying. And hopefully we'll get to the end and you'll be able to ask some questions and we can have a bit of a discussion then. Just before I start, what I would like to do is just to remind you that I'm summarising the key elements from the Building Better Regions Fund guidelines and its associated documentation. This should not substitute from you from actually reading all the documentation that's provided, both guidelines, fact sheets, and everything else that is provided for you in the application process. Because it's really important that you actually understand all the elements of it when you're writing your application. There are differences between the infrastructure project stream and the community investment stream. Today, while I will mention and talk about both streams, I will primarily be focusing on the infrastructure project stream, as this is most likely the stream of funding under Building Better Regions Fund or BBRF that you'll be applying under. Excuse me. Yeah, so also, as I said, feel free to go back and watch the previous webinar that may provide some additional information covering both writing for government grants and also Building Better Regions Fund. But today, as we did not have last time the guidelines out, we'll be able to give you a clearer picture of what is being asked for this round of BBRF. So just a quick recap. For those of you, again, who are familiar with BBRF, you'll probably understand that this is the government's premier region, it's the federal government's premier regional funding program. It's highly valued by government and participants. Each round so far has offered up $200 million worth of funding. It's highly competitive. It's available throughout Australia in all regional and remote areas. The areas of exclusion are the 5 main capitals: Perth, Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and the urban area of Canberra. Pretty much everywhere else is available to is able to apply for the funding. It's broken into 2 streams, as I mentioned earlier: the infrastructure project stream and the community investment stream. And we, as I said, we'll be focusing on infrastructure in this particular discussion. There are some key differences from round 4. Primarily, round 4 was specifically dedicated to helping communities who had been drought affected and providing funding for those communities in that circumstance. So there was a fairly restricted round in terms of who could apply for. This round is much more broad, but is, as you're probably all aware, focusing of the $200 million, $100 million has been dedicated towards tourism-related infrastructure projects. So for those of you who, again, tuned in last time, about 95% of the $200 million tends to go to infrastructure projects, and the remaining 5% on community investment projects, because they tend to be a lot smaller. The project split is generally 50-50 between the two, but this year, $100 million has been set aside for tourism-related infrastructure projects, which means if your project's not tourism-related, you'll just have a pool of $100 million to apply for. There are a few other little additional requirements hidden in the detail in the application form. There's things such as they're now limiting pre-construction activities to 20% of the total eligible expenditure. I suspect that is largely because they expect your project to be shovel ready and ready to go, and a lot of that pre-work will be done. There is, again, real emphasis on investment-ready projects, especially in the infrastructure field. They're looking that you be, once you've got your grant application approved and a funding agreement executed, that you start within 12 weeks. Start your project within 12 weeks. And they're also asking you now to, I guess, outline as part of the application process the mitigation of health risks associated with COVID-19. So there are a few other little small tweaks here and there, but they're the main ones, and they sort of come up throughout the guidelines. There is a fact sheet and a Q&A sheet available online at the website for BBRF that will outline these changes in more detail. Just in case you're familiar with previous rounds, you can now see what this round's all about. Okay, so the grant itself, infrastructure project stream, you're allowed to apply for between $20,000 and $10 million in funding. Again, there is a large element dedicated to tourism-related infrastructure, and I'll try and stop repeating myself on that, but it is important. The community investment stream, projects there, you can apply for grants as small as $5,000 up to $1 million. They're the main things. Under infrastructure, again, what that's really about is for new, expanded or upgrade infrastructure projects, you can, I guess, the word replacement is if you're replacing an asset through this project, you would have to demonstrate how the replacement of the asset is leading to improved and increased outcomes in addition to just replacing it. So, for example, in the case of airports, if you're replacing a hangar, you would want to show how that replacement is actually going to provide additional benefit to the actual existing piece of infrastructure that was already there. Commonly, the funds are used for upgrading things like community halls, town centre redevelopments, water structure, infrastructure upgrades, sporting facilities and aged care units, things like that that help provide additional infrastructure to regional and remote Australia. The community investment stream, that's more, I guess, divided into things like planning for new or a new festival or a new element to an existing festival, strategic planning to boost regions, such as, a good one would be strategic planning to how you would boost the impact of tourism on the regional economy, and also strengthening leadership of your local region, such as youth leadership courses and things like that. I might focus a little bit more on the tourism-related infrastructure and what the guidelines are telling us about what they're looking for. So, as part of the application project, you will need to indicate on the form that you actually are applying under the tourism-related infrastructure funding pool, so that $100 million that's been set aside. And you'll need to demonstrate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the tourism industry in the region for which your project is set, and how this project and the funding that is being provided will mitigate the impacts of COVID-19 on tourism. So it's pretty narrow in the sense that it's not just a general tourism program, it's about how we can mitigate the impact of COVID-19. which is the whole point of setting the money aside for tourism-related infrastructure as part of the government's overall response to the pandemic. One idea that they suggest, and I think this is a very good one, you may want to talk to your local or regional, even state-based bodies, the tourism organisations, to provide some insights, get some support, see what they're thinking, how your project may contribute to that. Getting letters of support from them would be very beneficial. Your local Regional Development Australia or RDAs would also be able to provide you with some advice and some support in this nature, and certainly the guidelines encourage you to contact them. But you will need to build a very good business case if you're deciding to apply under the tourism-related infrastructure stream. The other thing that will be happening in the assessment process, according to the guidelines, is the department has indicated that it may actually consult with Austrade, who sort of have the overall federal purvey of tourism in Australia, on your application, and to see if what you're saying actually links up with what they think is a relevant tourism-related infrastructure. Okay, so I guess my view is, depending on the nature of any projects that you're thinking of applying for as a regional airport or as a local government body who runs a regional airport, you may want to consider which stream you want to apply under, whether it's the general infrastructure project stream, or you can actually say, yes, this is tourism related, and what kind of argument you could build there. And certainly that might be your starting point for discussion when you're looking to start your application. Just quickly on the community investment side of things, that's much more open. There's no particular requirement to indicate that you're supporting tourism in your local region. It's pretty much the same as previous rounds. And I know that some of you may have applied under that stream previously. Another big part of the grant funding is the expectations around co-contributions. So just again, a reminder, if you're in a regional area, you're expected to contribute up to 50% of the project costs. Now, that doesn't have to be you specifically. It can be sourced from other means, such as state government, philanthropic, the private sector, or other organisations. All they state is that the Commonwealth contribution, so that's BBRF and any other Commonwealth grant funding, cannot exceed 50%. Now, the guidelines go into some of the exceptions to this. So financial assistance grants that local governments receive are not included as Commonwealth government funding. That could be part of your contribution. And there are a few other exceptions there which are outlined in the guidelines. In remote areas, the contribution expected is 25%. So the Building Better Regions Fund can fund up to 75% of your project. So again, that's probably acknowledging the difficulty that many remote areas have in attracting funding and provide funding for worthwhile projects. Again, there is a possibility to apply under the guidelines through an exceptional circumstances exemption from having to provide a co-contribution. That's a separate part of the application process. So if you were to tick the box that said, I wish to apply for exceptional circumstances, you would have to build a business case in the application that it would explain and set out why you're unable to contribute or provide funding towards the project. If that rationale is accepted and approved, you will then go into the normal assessment round for your project, for the application, and if successful, the government can provide up to 100% of the funding. If you're unsuccessful, your application for exceptional circumstances, an exceptional circumstance exemption is not approved, you'll drop out of the application process. Again, the rationale for that is if the government's not providing the full amount of funding and you can't provide the rest, then the project logically cannot proceed. So that's probably a key thing to consider. I know many regions, many local government councils have gone through very difficult times in the last 12 to 18 months. Again, you can look at bushfires, you can look at drought, you can look at the COVID-19 pandemic, and also you can look at other things such as if you're a small local government body, you may have a very low rates base and not have the income to contribute. So all those are worth considering if you wish to apply for an exceptional circumstances exemption. The final thing I'll say about the grant itself, there's a stipulation that all projects must be completed by the 31st of December 2023. And I'll go into the timing of the grant in a bit more detail later on in this presentation. So you need to understand that when applying, that if you've got a project that may take longer than that, you may need to consider whether you wish to proceed with this round. Oh, and the final thing is the tip down the bottom is very important. You cannot start your project prior to the execution of the grant agreement. So if you're applying for funding, that's something you've got on the way at the moment and a project you've started, it would not be eligible. Okay, speaking of eligibility, it can be a bit of a minefield in the Building Better Regions Fund application process. There are a number of parts to eligibility, and I'll go through those in some detail because it is something that organisations applying for can get tripped up on. It's not just the organisations, but locations, activity and expenditure. All those things come into eligibility requirements, and you need to consider all those aspects when you're making application. So for a start, as an organisation, the basic details are that you must have an Australian business number, you must be either an incorporated not-for-profit, a local government agency or body as defined under the Commonwealth Local Government Financial Assistance Act from 1995, or be a non-distributing cooperative. So basically a not-for-profit organisation. There are a list of particular organisations that are included and recognised as local governments in the guidelines. For example, the ACT government is considered local government for the purposes of the Building Better Regions Fund because there is no local government other than the ACT government in the Australian Capital Territory. Places like Norfolk Island, where else have we got? Other unincorporated areas such as the far northwest of New South Wales, and a number of other particular regions that for whatever reason don't have a standard local government arrangement but have a body that takes care of local government concerns. So again, check those for eligibility. Locational, as I've said before, it's pretty much everywhere outside those 5 big capital cities and Canberra. There is a tool on the website that you can go to see where your project is and make sure that it is in an area that is eligible. So pretty much if you're outside those large urban areas, you'll be right. Previously mentioned both Hobart and Darwin are included in as regional. So if you are in the middle of Darwin or the middle of Hobart, you are still able to apply. There is an exception which says that even though your project may take place, say in Adelaide, if the majority or a significant part of the impact of your project takes place in a regional area, that may be considered for funding. But my experience has been there have been very few and far between of those projects approved, but you may have a very good argument and a business case why your project that may be based in the city of Adelaide is impacting regional South Australia for most of its outcomes, and then you can make that argument. The other kind of thing is, I guess you've got to have an eligible activity. So I've gone through a bit of those in the previously about the types of infrastructure activities that they're looking for, the types of community investment activities they're looking for. Again, read the guidelines, make sure your activity does fit that barrier, that requirement. So if you're, for example, halfway through a building project and you've run out of funding and you're applying for additional funding, you may be outside the requirements. If you're just looking to replace a building as is for infrastructure, it probably won't be an eligible activity. So just pay attention to those details before you're making a decision to apply. And then obviously when you do make the decision to apply and you're filling out the application form, be very specific about what the project is and what you're asking for, what you're asking the funding for to assist. The final area is expenditure. Again, eligible expenditure must be a direct cost of the project and be incurred by you, the applicant. So what that means is obviously direct cost of the project's pretty obvious, but you have to incur the cost. So if you're partnering with another organisation and they're helping you build a building or extend your tarmac, and they're actually incurring the cost, then those project costs will not be eligible. You have to incur the cost. So then that means that if you're getting additional funding from outside bodies, whether it's state government, private sector, or again, philanthropic areas, they must actually, I guess, transfer the fund to you so that you can pay for the cost incurred that they're not paying on your behalf. It's a point that when you go to put in your reports and your finances, they will check, they will look at who's made the payment, what's the payment against, and they will analyse that. The other thing, of course, is expenditure cannot be incurred before the project starts. So, for example, if you're constructing and you've already pre-purchased materials before you've got an executed contract, those costs won't be eligible under the project. You'll need to have incurred those costs once you have a executed contract. Again, that is something that I've seen. Obviously, people get a bit tied up in. They need to get their materials. They need to be shovel ready, so they're pre-buying stuff. They're getting all set up, but then they find that perhaps they may not actually have that element of the project funded because they incurred those costs before they had an executed contract. If you're in doubt, very strongly suggest ringing the helpline, the Building Better Regions Fund helpline through the Business Grants Hub, and working through those technicalities with them before you start committing yourselves. There's a whole list of ineligible expenditures. They're all in the guidelines. You can't purchase land, you can't pay your employees, you can't fund business as usual operations. Those kind of things are all very important to check out. And as I alluded to earlier, infrastructure projects need to be investment ready. It means they need to be shovel ready, which means they need to be good to go. So a lot of the pre-planning work and everything else needs to happen, albeit they need to be ready to go by the time you've executed the contract or within 12 weeks of executing the contract. Okay, just excuse me while I have a drink of water. Okay, so the application itself, as everything is these days, the application form is made online. You have to go in and register yourself, the email to which they'll send a link for you to make application. You can actually, there's a place there on the application form where you indicate if you've got someone who's helping you fill out the application form, like an external grants writer. You can put their details in there and they will also get a link to the application. The important thing is with that, whoever is writing your application for you, and even if you've got a staff member doing it, the person who signs off on the application and submits it must have the authority to do so, and it's usually someone such as the CEO or someone who's got the capacity to sign off on official documentations for your organisation. So you need to check all the details of the application, make sure you're satisfied with them before the appropriate person in your organisation signs off on that. I won't go into everything on the application form per se, because a lot of it is pretty much standard organisational details and contacts. You'll need to provide financial information, a budget. You'll need to confirm things like your funding sources. They talk about all that throughout the application. Importantly, you'll need to fill out every page of the application. There'll be some bits that will and won't apply, but you'll work through those as you go through. For example, if you don't tick the box that says you're applying for an exceptional circumstances exemption, you won't have to fill those bits out. If your project is under $1 million, you will not have to do a cost benefit analysis, so you won't need to attach that. But the application form, it's pretty, well, I think it's user friendly. Obviously, it depends how familiar you are with these things and filling out government forms online, but it's fairly intuitive and it will guide you. And again, please read all the documentation. There's a website there up in front of you. If you've got any questions, it's always worth ringing the contact number there, because it's better to ask a question that might seem a little bit silly at the time and get it right than not ask it and then make a mistake in your application. Generally speaking, if there's an obvious error, the department may contact you, or they may not, but once the deadline for applications close, you cannot amend the application or add anything to it. So be very careful to make sure you get everything as it should be before you submit the application. As part of the application process, as well as addressing the merit assessment criteria, you will also be asked to indicate, write a bit about your project. So that will be describing your project, writing about project outcomes, milestones, risk and project management plans. A lot of the free text fields are capped. You will need to be concise. It's one of those balances between being concise and about providing appropriate information. Where you're allowed to make attachments, I encourage you to do so, but don't do the thing where you just put "see attached" and then attach your 2,000 word document as an attachment. You might find that they will struggle to get through that. So you need to still be concise in what you say in the free text fields. As I said, there'll be a budget summary. You'll need to confirm your finances. And again, if you're making exceptional circumstances business cases, you will need to fill those out. And I think, again, it's a pretty straightforward process, but there is lots of complexity within that process. But hopefully the application form online, is the way it's designed, will step you through that process. Okay, so now we get to the assessment criteria, which is obviously the core of the application process. This is where you make your claims against the assessment criteria, and you seek to basically make your case as to why you should receive the funding for your project. There are 4 assessment criteria. The first 2, economic benefits and social benefits, are worth 15 points out of a total of 40, and the remaining 2 are 5 points. So importantly, the way the Building Better Regions Fund assesses its projects is that you must score at least 60% against each assessment criteria to be considered what we call value with relevant money, to be considered that your project is a worthwhile project for the department to recommend forward to the ministerial panel for funding. So if my maths is right, that's at least scoring 9 out of 15 for the first 2 criteria and 3 out of 5 for the next 2 criteria. You need to make sure that you're at that 60% or above mark for each of the criteria. So say, for example, you're able to demonstrate and score above 60% for the first 3 criteria, but not the 4th one, even though you might have more than 60% total points against the project. You will still be found not valued with relevant money as part of that process. So they're looking for a well-rounded response to the assessment criteria. I might just dig into it a little bit more, especially around economic benefits and social benefits. So economic benefits are, as you might suspect, it's about the extent to which your project meets the needs of the regional community in terms of the broader economic or social benefit impact. For the economic impact, it's the increase in value of jobs or businesses using local suppliers, the ongoing impact of your project from an economic point of view, increasing efficiencies that will lead to better outcomes economically. Those kind of things would really, I think, support. Sorry, I'm just turning my phone down. Support the argument. In the social benefit space, it's the broader. If you think about our overall outcomes of the Building Better Regions Fund, it's the broader social outcomes about how this supports the community that you're operating in from a cohesion, leadership, better functioning point of view, that it makes it a better place to be, a better place to live, increases the resilience of the area. Those kind of things are all something that that the Building Better Regions Fund is aiming to do. The project delivery, again, what they want to see here demonstrated through both things written in this assessment criteria, but also your project management plan and your risk assessments, is that you are able to deliver the project, you have the capacity and the capability to do it, and you're well advanced in your planning to deliver the project. And the impact of the funding itself, that's pretty much saying how the funding from the Commonwealth will support you in the delivery of your outcomes, and the fact that without this, what would be the impact if the funding wasn't provided? Would the project still proceed? Would it not proceed? How vital is this funding, and what can you do with it as you roll out this project? The other thing that they are also interested in is how, especially for infrastructure projects, is the ongoing benefits to the community once the project's finished. So if you're building a piece of infrastructure, the fact that you can maintain that piece of infrastructure beyond the project period, and the ongoing benefits to the community as a result of that piece of infrastructure. And that might be the same for, say, a community investment leadership training course. What ongoing benefits will be generated from the project? Okay, now this is also very important. There's a lot of key documents that you need to attach to the application form. Again, it's a bit of a choose your own adventure in that not all documentation will be relevant to your application, and you may not need to attach some documentation, but where you are required to attach a piece of documentation, you must do so. Again, I've seen cases where a lot of good applications who have done everything right at the final stage in the rush to submit the application have forgotten to attach a key piece of documentation. As a result, the application hasn't been able to be taken forward. So it's really important to provide evidence that will demonstrate things like, if you're applying for tourism-related infrastructure, that you can actually provide evidence to demonstrate that. Certainly throughout the guidelines, throughout the application process, it's not just about making a statement of plans, it's about providing evidence to back up those statements. So especially if you're looking at the economic aspects of employment, and they will be asking you how many direct employment jobs and indirect employment jobs will be generated from your project, both during the course of the delivery of the project and as an ongoing impact after the project. Those things will be important to be able to substantiate. In the case of employment, there's a fact sheet on that. There's also a fact sheet on demonstrating tourism-related infrastructure and what you need to do there. Again, you'll have to make a case for demonstrating exceptional circumstances, co-funding exemption, supporting your claims against the merit criteria, especially the community support and your co-funding contributions. There, as part of the documentation, there's an example letter that you could use for other organisations that are submitting or providing co-funding for you to provide as evidence that those organisations are contributing. So it would need to be, for example, on their letterhead, signed by their relevant CEO or financial person, etc. There is an accountant's declaration form that you'll be required to sign that says that you have the money and able to contribute it towards the project. If you are a not-for-profit organisation, you need to provide evidence of that, and if you're a trust, you need to provide those documentations. If your project is taking place on, obviously, if you're building something, it's got to be built on a piece of dirt. So whoever owns that land needs to provide demonstrate that you've got the authority of the landowner to conduct the project. And again, there's an example letter provided in the documentation. Importantly, again, you don't actually have to own the piece of land where the project might be taking place. You need to have the authority of the landowner to conduct the project. And there's a bit more detail in there when it comes to, say, building something on someone else's land. So whether you've got a lease or all those kind of things need to be taken into place. And again, if your grant's over the $1 million mark, so this will apply to infrastructure-related projects that are over $1 million, you'll need to provide a cost-benefit analysis. Again, if it asks you to provide the documentation, you must do so, and you must pay as much attention to that as you do to the overall application form if you want to provide a strong and competitive application. Okay, so now I hope that's given you a bit of a good overview of the application process itself, and as I said, I'm happy to answer questions towards the end. The process itself, So the selection process and timing. So this is quite interesting. As we know, applications close on the 5th of March, and then the department will, the first thing they'll do once applications close is they'll assess your eligibility for your application. If your application passes the eligibility test, it will go through to being assessed for funding. If it doesn't pass the eligibility test, it won't be assessed, it won't be merit assessed. If you've applied for a co-funding exemption for exceptional circumstances, they will then process those applications, and they will make a decision will be made by the ministerial panel on whether or not they will accept your request to be exempt. If it's accepted, you'll go through to the merit assessment process. If it's not accepted, again, you'll be put aside and the application will not go any further. So the department will then, once they've finalised the merit assessments, they will provide recommendations to the ministerial panel. The ministerial panel is chaired by the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. That's the Deputy Prime Minister, the Honourable Michael McCormack. The panel, in conjunction with Cabinet, will make a final decision on the outcomes of the assessment and final approvals. There is, importantly, it's worth reading the section in the guidelines, particularly, as opposed to you need to read all the guidelines, which outlines the other things that the ministerial panel can take into consideration when making their decision. That's things like the spread of projects and funding across regions, the regional impact of the projects, including on Indigenous employment and local supply use, other existing or similar projects that are being planned for the region, projects that I guess level of funding you may have accrued in previous rounds. They're very keen to see this $200 million spread going to good projects all across the country. And as I previously said, it's highly competitive. We get over $1 billion worth of grant funding applications in most rounds, so they can't fund everything. And the other thing is their Australian government priorities, and obviously they've indicated this round it's all about tourism, but that may not be the only priority they take into consideration. They also, interestingly, will take on the reputational risk to the Australian government when choosing projects. So if there's a project that, for whatever reason, I can't think of any offhand, certainly there wouldn't be any in the airport space that they think might pose a reputational risk, they may decline to fund it. So there's a whole lot of extra things that they will be discussing in their ministerial panels. Even when I was with the department, I never attended one of those meetings, so I don't know what they discuss, but their guideline gives an outline of the kind of things that they will consider in addition to the application itself, which is why it's important to cover as much as you can and provide the best application you can so that you get a good recommendation from the department in terms of your grant funding. The timing for the process, I guess from the conclusion of the application round, so from the 5th of March to announcements is made based on previous rounds, usually takes around 3 to 4 months. So if that's the case and that it holds true to that, we could expect the announcements to be made around June, July this year. And then successful applications after that applicants will be contacted, and we will start to negotiate your grant funding agreements with the department. That can take a very short space of time, or complex ones, it may take a little bit longer. But if you're successful, you could be expecting to start your project in the second half of 2021, which would leave you just under 2.5 years to complete the project by the 31st of December 2023. Obviously, it's a smaller project. You might be looking to complete it sooner than that. One thing I will, as a bit of a note of warning, is that even though your funding application may be approved by the ministerial panel, even though the department may have notified you that you've been successful, during the negotiation phase for the grant agreement, things can come unstuck. Most commonly, the department will get you to reconfirm your funding sources, and given that you may be putting your application in February, and you might be talking to the department about your successful application in July, August, there is a chance that if you have a co-funding contributor, they may have dropped out. Now, if they drop out and you're not able to make up that funding, that could jeopardise your application process. So again, it's really important that you lock in those co-funding contributions, and there is a high degree of certainty that that funding will be there when you need it. We have had examples in the past where BBRF application process has taken, an assessment process has taken place over, say, a council, local government elections. So let's just pick a random state, no one in particular, but Queensland may be holding their local government elections in April. I don't know if they are or not. So the current council, for example, could have put in an application for a project that they wanted to do. A new council might be elected with a new mayor. They may want to take things in a different direction, and they may want to modify. While they might be successful funding, they may decide they want to modify the project. That would have to be negotiated with the department, and if it was a big departure from the original application, the grant funding may not go ahead. So there's an example where things can get a bit messy, but basically, if you've got everything locked in and it is as the same as the day you applied, with very few variations, then you know that it should go ahead. Now, I'm not talking about you're building a building and you were going to paint it green and now you want to paint it blue. I don't think that's going to impact the project. But if you were going to build an aircraft hangar and all of a sudden you wanted to extend the tarmac instead, that could jeopardise the project because you were assessed on the basis of building an aircraft hangar. Okay, and I guess the final stage in the project is all applicants, but particularly those that were unsuccessful, will be given the opportunity to seek feedback from the department. Those sessions are well worth taking, even if you are successful, because they will help you with your next application. All right, so finally, before we just move to questions, I'll just say that Morrison Piper Advisory, as I said before, we can help with you with any part of the application process. We offer a half-hour free consultation if you just want to discuss your project. One or two members of the previous webinar have already taken us up on that offer. It's obligation free. We're happy to talk about your specific project and how it might fit into Building Better Regions Fund round. We're also happy to work with you on any aspects of applying for the grant, managing the grant and including the grant, and any other grant fund you may be interested in applying for. And so feel free to contact us. Our contact details are there. And I think I will now leave time for questions and hand back to Sam.
Thanks so much, Andrew, for that wonderful, valuable presentation. We do have a couple of questions. The first one asks, in terms of an airport, does the infrastructure need to create jobs and have an economic benefit? For example, rebuilding a hangar could be seen as a commercial advantage.
Right, okay. Definitely when it comes to this round, because it's a competitive round, you'll need to stack up as many economic outcomes as possible. So jobs, obviously there's jobs created in construction, full stop. I will be looking for you to record how many direct job numbers will be created and how many indirect ongoing job numbers will be created. Again, as I touched on, if you're just replacing an existing hangar, that activity may not be an approved activity, but say you had an existing hangar that housed 3 aircraft and you were extending it to house, you were knocking it down and building a new one that was going to house 6 aircraft, that would definitely be expansion to what was there before, and they would consider that. It's in your interest to talk up and demonstrate the ongoing and substantial economic impact. So if there was going to be no impact that you could demonstrate as part of your application, it probably wouldn't score that well against the economic benefits. But you could also talk about the fact that the hangar is in disrepair, it will become unusable very soon, and that will have a negative impact on the economic impact of the project and the region.
Thanks so much, Andrew. As well, we have another question that asks, are privately owned and operated airports eligible?
Unfortunately, not. So if you're a for-profit organisation, you're not eligible under the Building Better Regions Fund. This is definitely aimed at not-for-profits and community organisations and local government. But again, happy to talk about the particular circumstances.
Is when the application process is being, I guess, marked, is the capability or the size of the organisation applying ever taken into consideration?
That's a very good question. Look, in my previous webinar on this, I guess I mentioned the term scalability when it came to making applications. So that is, if you're applying for, you know, $50,000 just to put in an information kiosk in your terminal, you wouldn't be expected to put in the same amount of detail as if you're applying for a $10 million to build $10 million to contribute towards building a new terminal. So that's scalability in terms of what you need to include in the application. In terms of your capacity and capability to actually write the application, it's a competitive process, and they won't take into consideration that you're a small organisation as opposed to a very large regional council and who may have half a dozen grant writers. They will assess it on the information you provide. So again, even though you may be a small organisation, it's important that you put the best application in that you can put in, and in terms of project management, that you demonstrate that you are able to deliver the project in accordance with the grant funding, in accordance with the timeframes.
Thanks so much. The final question we had was about a copy of your presentation, Andrew, and your contact details. So to that person that asked that question, we can send those on after today's presentation. But Andrew, thank you so much for the webinar today. We have had a great response to both your first webinar and also this one. We will, as we said, make your presentation available. Alternatively, those still on the line can download it under the handout section on the control panel. So Andrew, thank you so much for your time. We do know it takes a lot of your time to put together the presentation for today, so we really appreciate that. Once again, if anyone has any additional questions, feel free to send those through to the AAA and we can forward those on to Andrew at another time. So thank you, Andrew. We will leave it there.
Thank you very much, Sam, and to the AAA and all the members.
Thank you. Also, for those still on the line, we would like to remind you that the May 26th and 27th Pavements and Lighting Forum will be going ahead on the Gold Coast. We are very excited to be having an in-person event for the first time in, I think, over 12 months. So it is very exciting for both those of us at the AAA and also our membership. If you or someone else you know would like to either present at the Pavements and Lighting Forum or sit on a panel session, feel free to drop us an email to either nominate yourself or someone else. As always, we're here to help, so please get in contact at any time with any questions or any feedback. I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thank you.